Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Alana, and this is part of an ongoing development, actually. David Boje and Grace Ann Rosile are professors emeritus at the University of New Mexico. David's taught in many places, and he's written many books. And he is one of the great minds of qualitative research. And I was privileged enough to work with him when I was teaching on a couple of I supervised on one and he was the second on the committee, and then it was the other way around for another student. And I had those experiences, and we've talked a few times. So that led me to have conversations with him, which were but this is a man who has so much going on in his head and has been doing qualitative research for so many years and watched it develop for such a long period of time that he condenses years and years and years into a few sentences. So his work is hard to grasp. In answer to that, we've opened up the www.wooclap.com/story science. And if you go there, you're going to see that there's a place for you to put in the lower left-hand corner. There's a tag, and you can click on process, theory, or questions. And you can type in something that's caught your eye, reflective moment on the process he's talking about. Or later today in the second video, we're going to see his theoretical opinions, and you can make comments on those. And if you have questions, you can put them in the questions. That happened last week, and people responded beautifully to the Woo Clap, and I took those back to David and Grace Ann. So what I'm showing you now for the next 16 minutes is their response to last week's question, the beginning of their response to last week's questions, because they're David's the kind of man that when he starts to talk he says a lot. And so I clipped the video this morning to just the answers to their question, because I promised last week I would also show their theoretical part of the first video. So now I'm left with another set of video, and we'll talk about that at the very end. Thank you all for being here, and for those watching by recording, I think this is a stunning event, and you'll be very happy you came. Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Alana again, and what's happened in the meantime was that I sent last week's process statements and questions on to David and Grace Ann, and they're very nicely have decided to come back to us and have conversation about what we were thinking, etc. So welcome, David Boje and Grace Ann Rosile. Thank you so much for being here. And I have a couple of other questions that you haven't seen yet that I'll throw in too. So David and Grace Ann, what did you think when you saw the process statements and the questions from last week that students had?
Yeah, these are great questions, and I love the process comments. So we did create a slide on the titles of some of the dissertations that are using the methodology we've been talking about. Some of them are brand new, so I don't know if they'll be posted yet, but yeah, go ahead and look at them. They're all done a little differently, so you can see a lot of variety in the work they're doing.
What's the purpose?
Yeah, the self-correcting storytelling allows you to be in the moment doing acts of what's called counter story. And that's little ways to kind of tilt the conversation so you're actually testing as you're in the moment of the storytelling conversation. And it's a safe place for sharing back and forth. So you're not trying to alienate the other person, but you are sharing your story first, and then they're sharing their story, and you're doing it back and forth. So that's how it's different than narrative interviewing. Because in storytelling conversations, you're there with the gift of your story, rather than trying to say, I'm controlling bias by pretending I don't exist in the world, which is impossible, you know?
Okay, so then if I can feed that back to you, I'm hearing that part of the purpose is to make our own portion of doing this work, like put it in. My words are failing me a little bit, but like legitimizing the fact that the researcher has effect on the research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
I was just reading something, a science magazine the other day, and they have a term that that was called human in the loop in their scientific research for algorithms and stuff. And I thought, that's what we do. We put ourselves in the loop instead of pretending to be outside of what we're studying. And they're the one we're studying, and I have a bias and they have a bias. No, we're just all in it together in a system. So we're all inside.
Okay, so that's a significant purpose. And then what's this? Tell me a little bit more about counter story.
Okay, you have story and counter story, meaning that they tell you a story, right? And then you're going to counter with a story. Is it going to be just an affirmation of the exact same kind of experience? Or are you going to tilt it a little bit and say, oh, well, that was really good. It worked that way for me, except, hey, my mother never hugged me. Or, you know, the CEO was always jumping in, you know, so there's a little tilt going on. And that allows you to check and do some tests of, am I getting what they say? Are they getting what I say? Am I morally got a quandary here and I want to go a different direction with this? You know, so I don't get to be a fly in the wall. I have to be part of the action.
Okay, so and in a safe way. I like the safe space of sharing and acknowledging. So because the framework sets us up to be there and acknowledges our purpose in being there, and because the back and forth tests whether or not our understanding is correct. So we don't have to come back later and say, did you get this? The conversation, if captured well, does that for us.
Yeah, it's a natural part of the conversational storytelling. People are always checking it out, and you can tell by somebody asks, you can tell about their body language, you can tell their posture, the tone of their voice. There's all kinds of what people ask about is intersubjectivity. That's a very, very important concept in all of this. How does intersubjectivity work? We're going to get to that in some of the slides.
Okay, so I think we can jump on then. What else have you given us?
Somebody asked about what are the 4 waves of grounded theory. A lot of people new to this work, or even the old ones, don't realize that there's been 4 different waves of grounded theory, starting with the classic Glasser and Strauss in 1967. This was very much inductivism, meaning that he didn't go out with a preset theory. Even a lot of research, you were sort of in the moment, reacting to what was there and just sort of grooving with it. Then the second wave, Glasser and Strauss split up like a marriage. They divorced, and there Glasser kept going with kind of the open-ended, be in the moment, don't do a lot of prep, go with the flow. But Corbin was more of a positivist and wanted to have structured inquiry, a lot of note taking, a lot of what you see now in grounded theory, where you're asked to do these session notes and notes on the transcript and notes of the notes of the notes. This very detailed thing, and that's where most people are treating grounded theory. But Glasser didn't do that. And then in the third wave, a bunch of people, but I put some references there, sort of said, well, aren't we just dealing with epistemology and its social construction. They have their construction, you have their construction. Everybody has a construction. Whoopee. So now we've created the fourth wave, which is more about being in the world. How are we being in the world, and what's our nature of being in the world? So it's not just knowing. We've taken another step into the existential, our existence in the world. It's called ontology. And that's where we use self-correcting, because now we're trying to change the science of grounded theory, where we're using a combination of what Charles Saunders Peirce calls abduction, induction, deduction. We call it the AID model. And there's slides coming up for that. So that's what you need to understand, is how this fourth wave differ from the other waves, or whatever your grounded theory you're using. You need to know what kind of wave you're in. What are you surfing, you know?
Yeah, that's well done. Okay. Anti-narrative.
Yeah, people have asked about this. What's anti-narrative? So if you go to the next slide, we'll try to give you some definitions and meaning. 3 books. First, the initial concept came in 2001 when I was asked to write a book on narrative methods. And I put anti-narrative in as just what is the bet on the future, sort of prospective sense making. And then I said, what's before? What's happening? Historical. So you go in and do a conversational storytelling interview, but there's history before, there's anticipation of what's coming. So that came out of the 2001 book. By 2011, we expanded it, and a lot of other people were writing essays, so there's the handbook. By 2016, the notion of the story, counter story, narrative, counter narrative came in, and we were expanding to look at the whole system of storytelling in a particular setting. So that's what's different about doing just a life history interview or a narrative interview, is we're looking at the whole system of the enterprise, whatever scale that you're looking at. That could be a family, an organization, it could be a community, it could be a nation, global, you know. So we're looking at all the storytelling dynamics. And in that, you have what's on the next slide. We now have the 6 concepts, the becoming of the story, right? The bets on the future, the between, and that's kind of the infrastructure of the story, the whole history before, the beneath, all the concepts and language and symbols that go along with having any kind of coherent communication. It depends on that beneathness. And then we have the latest construct is called beyond, and that gets at this intersubjectivity, like how can we have an intuitive grasp in the moment of what's happening. And it's not really by our thinking, it's more of a heartfelt kind of sensing that's going on. And Charles Saunders Peirce, the father of semiotics, he called it an abduction. We have an intuitive sense, but it's not enough to say, oh, it's a full-blown theory. And it's not enough to say, oh, we're testing it now. It's sort of like, wow, I got a flash of an idea. It's an inspirational moment. Whoa. And it's right there. That doesn't mean it's at the beginning of your research project. It means that you're right there in the field investigating, and the beyond is there with you. I don't know if that makes sense. It's what Heidegger calls foregrasping. You're grasping before by your intuition.
Let me add to that the idea of anti-narrative is context. So we don't really understand a story until we understand the context. And a simple example that I've sometimes used is, there's a phrase, someone says, "Are you going to eat that?" Well, what does that mean? And what it means, it
means I want it.
It depends on what's this, where are you? What happened before this?
Right.
Did he just finish and I still have food? Or, what's going on? And are we a husband and wife? Are we two women?
Yeah.
Two women probably means something very different. Are you going to eat that?
Or a mother and child.
Oh, okay.
So,
no, I never meant that. Never.
Yeah.
Never.
So all of those things that came before, the situation, all of that stuff, and they relate to the 6 B's, but that's a simple way to think of how the meaning changes depending on all those elements of what came before, what we expect afterwards. It goes right to your hips.
Yeah.
All of those pieces make the story.
In the Beneath, we share a lot of common experiences, a lot of common language. So we don't need to share the whole story. We just share little bits of it. And somebody asked about what if you're getting parts of the story? Well, welcome to reality. You're always getting little bits because people assume that you know the rest of it. Even if you don't, they assume, oh, you know my needs as a wife. Well, yeah, maybe a little bit. But it allows us to communicate, assuming that we're in the know with each other. And people outside of being in the know, like new researchers coming in to look at a scene, they'll go, wow, everybody's assuming I know everything, and I don't know everything. And that's why it takes a lot of research on the before, the between, the beyond, beneath, the bets on the future. All these things are happening in the storytelling conversation.
And that's also why bias is irrelevant.
Well, Nietzsche said we're all biased.
Yeah.
Everybody is biased.
Yeah.
So it's a question of
we just have to acknowledge.
That's where self-reflexivity comes in all through the research process, because you got a bias going in and you're judging, evaluating, and that's what people do. But owning it is how you control bias, not saying I don't have bias. That's ridiculous. You have bias, you own it. Yes, they have bias. That's why there's story and counter story, as you're checking everything out, but not in a totally belligerent way. It's not Derrida says, an interview is an interrogation, a moment of terror. And that's when it's one-sided, where a dominant party is lording it over. We want to bring it into equality, a co-creation, a co-investigation, a partnering with your client, with your interviewee. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And the B's mean that what that person is expressing, if you understand all of the 6 B's and the Auntie narrative, then you understand why they said what they said. And to them, it's not bias, it's just what is.
Yes.
It's their reality.
You've unpacked their picture of reality. And
Yes.
you trust that you've unpacked their picture of reality.
And you're trusting them to see your story.
To
treat your story with reverence, rather than going into the thing, well, I'm not going to tell them that I'm interested in reversing Maslow's pyramid, So I'll just tell them about self-actualization. Then we'll talk about self-esteem. But I won't tell them that I really don't agree with this theory, Well, that you're the one that's trying to deceive the public,
Right.
And that
Okay.
there's a problem.
I think these would also be more interesting research articles to read.
I hope so.
Mm-hmm.
I hope so, because they're autoethnographic and ethnographic at the same time.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I hear you holding researchers to a lot of standards, because autoethnography is way much more than, I don't know. It has, people might misuse autoethnography to kind of whine their own story rather than investigate their own story. That's what I'm saying. So you're holding
it's a very much of a crying project, autoethnography, because you're doing the kind of soul-searching, self-reflexivity of why am I in the world? What is my being here? How am I impacting others? How am I complicit in all the things I'm critical about? So it's quite an investigation to do autoethnography.
Okay, so that was the first That was their response. And if you go to your handouts now that I put up while they were talking, you'll see a bunch of slides, and you'll see that the www.wooclap.com was the first slide of what we had last week. And these were live responses. So what they were talking about today was what they had read from other people like you who had commented at the time. What I thought about this last slide, I'm very interested in this work. I'm a qualitative researcher. I've been doing action research most of my career. And like David, as my career develops, I see that I want to take qualitative research differently. And I appreciate his work because I appreciate the fact that a conversation allows for a back and forth that naturally lets the other person tell the whole story or tell you more of the story. When I just went in with questions, I got answers. And then you have probing questions and you get probing answers. But you still as the researcher, still maintain way too much control and don't get enough out of them. And you don't even know that till you get back with your qualitative data and you don't have what you need exactly, or you have a lot of questions that you didn't realize you had later. And you're trying to develop themes after the fact, where these conversations that he's having allow you to develop themes and question the themes and go further with the person participating in guiding your thoughts. And then you go on to the next person. And as I appreciate what he says very much about, you're also equally looking for the people who don't agree with you. Now, the bit of video that I am not showing today is the place where he goes into detail about the process of doing that, the process of getting confirmation and having a few good conversations, and then going out to find the conversations that aren't in agreement with your first thoughts, so that you keep testing what you're learning as you go along. And that layout of his system is more time than we have today. So the second video today, and I suggest all of you've probably had some thoughts. This is the kind of work that it's nice that it's in video because you can see it over and over. I learned something hearing him repeat himself again. But I am reminding you that www.wooclap.com/story science is the place where you can go and record some of your thoughts and add to this growing population of people who are trying to tease out for themselves what this may have to do with their own work. So that's wooclap.com/story science. Now, already loaded is the second video, and this is going to be it was from the first tape. It was things cut out of the first tape, but it's specifically their story and personal story, and then the theoretical components that underlie this. So welcome everyone. This is Dr. Alana James, and I'm really excited. We have two professors emeritus with us today, Grace Ann Roselle and David Boje. And we're going to have a wide open conversation about storytelling and qualitative research and how it's evolved over time and where we see it going. So with that, let me just tell you for a moment why we're doing this, what we hope to accomplish. First off, I want to capture a movement of thought that I have seen develop over my career, as these two have as well. And qualitative data used to be kind of the wild, wild west, and now it's gotten to be these pretty confined silos of ideas. And so we have some ideas to share about where it might be going. I want to hear their stories because these two people are great storytellers. And to help qualitative researchers that are master's and doctoral students now see some of the magic that's possible and really what could be meant by this lived experience concept, and to learn from those who've come before us. So, and we have with us today two people who have a ton of books they have written. So at the end of this, there will be all kinds of resources and other things you can click through, etc. So with that, welcome again. And let's just say, Grace Ann and David, please tell us a little bit about yourselves and what has driven you in this work over your lifetimes.
Okay. I was an English major, and so people used to say you can do anything with a general liberal arts degree, and my response was you can do anything but nothing in particular. So after college, I went to graduate school and somehow ended up in the College of Business and focused on organizational behavior. Because having been an English major, what I loved was the people's stories. And when I found out, it wasn't until after my PhD was done that I ran into David like 10 years after my PhD. And I said, wow, you can do stories and have it be business? That's fabulous. And so that brought my two streams of interest together. And so my introduction to storytelling in the business world was through David. So later on, when we talk about what changes have come about, I guess I've sort of been in the front of those changes because I learned it all from David.
Yeah. So before David tells his story, I just have to tell our viewers that first time I met David, it was at a faculty meeting. I know who he is. This kind of casual guy comes into this faculty meeting and everybody is like, wow, David Boje. Wow.
The rare times.
And I'm a little cocky thinking, who is this guy? So David, how did you come to be that guy?
Well, when I met Grace Ann, my whole life changed, because she's into the mystical arts. And no, you're not. I'm discovering new things about her every day. But she led me into seeing a side of myself I'd never seen before, sort of getting in touch with, we did a lot of insight seminars. And, well, she said she wouldn't date me unless there was personal growth and development on my part. So I guess...
So you were
had a big impact on me.
Were you a professor of organizational development, or?
I was a professor of organizational behavior, graduated University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, and they taught me all about empiricism and statistical analysis and everything else. And there was one guy, Lou Pondy, who cultivated my interest in storytelling. He could see by my writing I was really into studying storytelling, and he encouraged it. And he went on to study anthropology as a professor on sabbatical, and it piqued my interest, motivated me to pursue storytelling from then on.
Okay. So
I'm a storyteller researcher. I'm a researcher.
Yeah. So this is early days. Storytelling's just evolving. So tell us a story.
Well, I sent you a couple of photos. I'm building an Earthship greenhouse, repacking old used tires I got from the tire shop up the street, and for free. And I'm taking recycled materials and trying to build a greenhouse that works in the desert. We only get 10 inches of rain a year, so I'm collecting, harvesting rainwater, and trying to build something out of recycled materials that'll work. Basically, I'm interested in the watershed. How do you treat your land as a watershed instead of just getting tap water, So I'm looking at how water comes down in rainfall and snowfall and how it travels and traverses the earth. And, the water courses through the veins of the soil of the earth. And treating it as a watershed is a whole different storytelling approach than tap water, if that makes any sense.
It actually makes a lot of sense. Where we are, people are planting trees in Ireland with the idea that it will help the sub-Saharan African desert.
Yeah. Well,
So
the water travels all around the world with the clouds and the winds, and we're all made of the same water.
So looking at qualitative data, which is probably why some of the people watching these tapes came, because they think they want to be qualitative researcher. How have you seen it change over the years? And you have made some bold comments about interviews, etc. So tell us what you think about qualitative work that right now, and how have you seen it change? When did you think it needed to change? And some of that, please.
Sure. For me, when I was studying the office supply in Los Angeles, there's a group of office supply companies under one ownership, and I discovered that people weren't telling whole stories. They rarely, as you transcribed 8 months of conversations, you could hardly find any stories that were whole stories. Instead, you found little fragments, little snippets here and there, and you had to read between the lines, and you had to fill in the blanks, and you had to do something called intersubjectivity analysis to really understand what the storytelling was at all. And, Harold Garfinkel is somebody I met and had dinner with and came to my house and my classes, and I went to his. And he was very into ethnomethodology, the study of methodology, and how we fill in very terse stories. We get little terse fragments, and then we fill in meaning around them. So that's where I decided that qualitative research really needed to change, because people were assuming that you could just go out and gather stories whole, like you pick fruit or something, pick tomatoes or oranges, but it's more like gathering grains of sand and composing something, or seeing how it's composed. And Grace Ann and I go through these little exercises where we try to understand each other. And, because we've known each other for 24 years and been married 23 years, I guess, right? It's true. Then, we know enough about each other to fill in the blanks, but when you meet a stranger or a situation you don't know very well, you don't know what to fill in, so much of the storytelling is untold, if that makes any sense, I hope.
It does, actually, because I'm thinking about my own, and two things came to mind. One is, if I'm filling in the blanks, my own biases are going to fill in those blanks for you. And the likelihood of my worldview and your worldview being the same diminishes with context and age and everything else. The second thing is, if I'm thinking about my early qualitative experience, it really rings true that you only get snippets. They answer your question. If you're doing key informant interviews, they answer your question, but you don't know whether or not your question encompassed their worldview at all.
No.
So they're giving you something, but it's filling your thing, not you seeing theirs. So it rings true. Does that feel right? And please add to it.
Tracy?
The part that I completely agree, and the part that I add to it is having been an English major, I love words and stories. But what I found was for 10 years I raised horses and trained them myself, and I found that that sometimes words don't exactly capture the experience. So now we've incorporated what we call embodied storytelling, because I'll tell you a story. The classic example
Okay.
of I got invited to this conference with David, I think only because I was with David and worked with him on storytelling, and all of the top people in the field were there, and including Carl White, who we talked to, wonderful man. And so I was doing a presentation on this different idea of how leadership and hierarchy works, because my experience with my horse was, it was a shared, negotiated process.
So I'm going to stop that for a second, because the people who were here last week heard that, and I'm hoping that this will let it move on. We're close to those of you who came for an hour and might have to leave at the end of the hour, even though the time was wrong. And those of you who have just entered, the challenge was that some of you were expecting 3:30 Irish time and some got 2:30 Irish time. But I'm hoping that this system allows me to move ahead, because let's see, if I move there and I play, will it do that?
A whole bunch of languages, right?
Yes.
So
hold on, let me find the right place. But if it's really synchronistic, metacognition becomes really important. So I know what I am. Okay, let's try there. Aha. This is probably the beginning of the philosophers. So for those of you that are studying, also I went, just as backstory, I went into Big Marker and I extended the time. So I hope not, they're going to not cut us off in 5 minutes. And so for those of you that can stay, assuming that it doesn't cut off, I will, we'll finish it. We'll have a good conversation, and we'll be here for as long as that is necessary. For those of you who do have to leave, know that you're going to get an email with, I'll take the suggestion from Veronica. I will put the videos up on YouTube, and I will send you the video connections. And I will also open up one more Monday morning, or Monday morning for you, Monday afternoon for me. That's an encapsulation of these ideas, because the last bit of video that is still to be shown could be stopped and started with conversation about what does that mean for our work? How do we do that? How do we get it done? And that would be a good conversation for me as someone who wants to take on these ideas, and for any of you who want to are thinking about whether or not this qualitative stance has some future in your qualitative research life. So we'll come back next Monday. It will be, and I will work this out with Big Marker, it will be at 3:30 Irish time, not 2:30 Irish time. However, I have to set that up. And again, apologies for those of you that came and I was late and didn't have it set up properly because of the time zone thing. So if you can stay, and if it lets us run past another 3 minutes, here's what he said on philosophers. And if it doesn't let us run past 3 minutes, we'll see this next week. So thank you.
I limited to five. My top five. So Mikhail Bakhtin, the Russian philosopher, he did a lot of writing in 1920s and 1930s. And he was actually exiled to Siberia for going against historical materialism and the dialectic. So he created all this stuff about polyphonic dialogism, multiple voices.
Oh.
And I constantly go back to his work again and again. I mean, in the last few weeks, I've been rereading some of his essays in dialogic imagination. And I'm just surprised at how much new stuff I'm learning that I missed before. So, for example, his whole thing is you have a whole bunch of languages, right? So when I'm building the Earthship greenhouse, there's the Earthship discourse language. There's photovoltaics. There's gardening. There's watershed management, rainwater harvesting. It's just a whole set of sciences that you're trying to tune into. And then that diversity is counterposed by the way that mainstream treats its food, its water, its human beings, and we're centralized, I think, into one kind of logic. In the United States, in particular, we have a kind of neoliberal focus on capitalism, and water is to be purchased, privatized, commodified, and it loses its organicness. So what I'm trying to do is look at this interplay, this contest between centralizing forces and decentralizing forces. And he came up with the word heteroglossia for this dynamics.
Say that again?
Heteroglossia.
Heteroglossia. Okay.
Like heterogeneous, and then there's many glossias.
Okay.
And it's the idea you have so many different disciplines and languages and sciences and popular discourses, and they're all in this mess.
Complexity soup.
Yeah, he says the background is a heteroglot. In other words, you just don't know what this is. It's just very confusing. And then in the foreground, people are creating stories and narratives to make sense of it, some of which are very, very monologic and confining, very constraining, and others are trying to open up and be diverse and plurality. And anyway, so he's my number one. My number two pick is Walter Benjamin, who wrote the essay on the storyteller and said storytelling is coming to an end because we're no longer singing the songs of the ship people and the miners, and the craftspeople aren't really working together in groups anymore. They've kind of been separated in division of labor, and we work in these consoles with computers and managers and hierarchy, so he's saying that that's really destroyed the fabric of storytelling, from lived experience, as you were saying, to something more artificial, more abstract, more. I think we're into what's called developing these politics of personality now, not living organically. So that's, I won't go further into Walter Benjamin, but I mean, if you're going to go into storytelling, Bakhtin and Benjamin are essential. And then for our work that we've been doing recently, Charles Saunders Peirce is really, really important, because from him we get the whole idea of science as a self-correcting process. And he talks about the relationship between your theory being deductive, your qualitative work being instead of inductive, deductive experiments, inductive self-reflections. And then his fabulous term is abduction, where think of it as a wild guess, as a hypothesis, as something, I sort of think something is happening here. I'm going to call it an abduction. Now I got to go test it with a qualitative method or a quantitative method, either one. And then through that induction, maybe I can build some theory, or I can see how some theory works. So we call it the AID model, the abduction, induction, deduction. So what's new in qualitative research, I think, is we're just going away from just doing in qualitative inquiry to now working with the theory and working with the abduction and putting the three together. And that's what we're doing in the self-correcting storytelling conversation book that Grace Ann and I wrote. Grace Ann did most of the organizing.
Aren't you lucky?
And
aren't you seriously lucky?
just a quick shout out to Karl Popper. I got interested in him when I was visiting New Zealand for a month, and 2 years in a row, actually. And there was a Karl Popper building, and I was going like, who's this Karl Popper guy, and why was he here, and what was he doing in New Zealand, Christchurch, New Zealand? And it turns out he was exiled from Germany, fleeing the Nazis, and he wanted an English-speaking country that would let him in and continue his work, and the only one that took him was New Zealand at the time. So he was there for a number of years, and there's a story in the book of how this guy went to one of his lectures, a scientist, and won the Nobel Prize because he asked a question to Karl Popper, like, my great theory is being disproved, and now I'm never going to be known as a great thinker. I'll never get a Nobel Prize. And Karl Popper said, look, develop a test to disprove your own theory, to refute your own theory, and you will be great. And so he did the test, and it got picked up and used in another project, and he got the Nobel Prize. Remember his name? We'll send you his name. Yeah.
Eccles.
Eccles. His name was Eccles, and he got knighted Sir Eccles in England. So anyway, Sir Eccles was there. So they just created all kinds of mischief when the two of them were in New Zealand. They were afraid that higher education wasn't treating scientific inquiry and scientific development seriously, and they actually nailed a proclamation on the door of the chancellor, that they needed to treat this seriously.
Mischief.
Yeah, so and the last one is Martin Heidegger, and he's been really influential in developing anti-narrative theory, anti-narrative theory, because he's dealing with that whole storytelling. He wants the whole of history, the whole of all of the voices together, much like Bakhtin. And he's got some concepts for dealing like force structuring. How do we work in advance to force structure something when we don't know what that something is? How do we get it to happen? So he has a number of concepts that we've applied to anti-narrative work. And it speaks to making an ontological turn. By that I mean beingness, not just knowingness, but being in the world. Like when I'm working with the greenhouse, I'm being with the clay and the sand and the wetness, and I actually get my muddy boots on and get in there and work with I take the gloves off and I'm mashing straw and clay and making cob, and that kind of hands-on being in the world. It's really different than reading about it and you say, oh, you watch a YouTube and say, oh, here's how you make cob. You may have 2 pails of sand and 4 pails of clay, but you test your clay sand mix, and well, all that is out the window when you get into the real world. You just got to play with the materials until you get a mix that works. And how much clay do I put in? How much straw? Well,
that's a great analogy for qualitative research. The first time you do it, you've got this, all these people you've read, and they say you should do this, and you've had to present. I know this is a system you don't like, but I'll just go back to the key informant interviews. You're supposed to do this. You're supposed to have these. You're supposed to, and then you go out, you meet people. And you're winging it. You're so winging it, trying to figure out how you get those people to tell you anything that can answer these questions that will get you out of your doctoral degree.
Yeah, they think you're from another planet, which you are. And when I do those semi-structured interviews, then they're required by everybody, every university, every doctoral program. What are your questions you're going to ask? And you need to register them with the IRB, Institutional Review Board, our ethics committee, et cetera. And it just takes all of the science out of it, because you're not doing inquiry anymore. You're pretending you already know what answers you're going to get from the questions you're going to ask. So there's no self-correcting going on by that other person.
How does somebody in your model approach an IRB? What are the questions they put down for an IRB? How do they manage them?
Make them up.
We make up some questions and we submit them.
Well, it's always, we're starting from here, and these are backup questions in case the person needs them. That's the way you present it.
We tell them we're going to have a conversation.
Yeah.
And then they say, oh, well, conversation really isn't covered by the IRB.
Yeah.
That's not really research. And you go, okay, fine. Does that mean I don't need an IRB? No, you need an IRB. You're going to talk to another human being.
Right.
Okay. Well, these are the kind of topics we'll be covering in the conversation. And I might ask a question like this, and this.
Okay.
And so this is where I think, I ended up getting involved in indigenous ways of knowing, indigenous studies, indigenous science. And there is kind of a funny story, but there was a grant, a call for proposals, and they wanted someone to teach ethics to the tribes. And I was like, they should be teaching us.
No kidding.
And some idiot is going to apply for this money and do it the wrong way. So I'll apply. And so I ended up getting into indigenous studies. And so what I found was part of it goes back to the image of riding a horse, right? I always thought, why are all these images in strategy and everywhere? They're so static and stationary that we're trying to capture the snapshot or identify the one path for strategy, and it's not like that. It's always changing. So, when you want your horse to turn right, it's sure you pull on the right rein, but there's a whole bunch of other things that you have to do depending on the circumstances and where the horse is and all of that. And our models don't accommodate that very well. Indigenous models, ways of knowing, they assume that the state of the world is flux all the time. And so it's been compared to quantum physics, that it's much more compatible with quantum physics. And so a lot of what we have done, and it was interesting when I was starting this work, David said, well, their stories are different too. They tell stories in a different way. And he had been writing about what he called living story. And it turned out that what David called living story, that he, through observation and organization, saw as the way storytelling takes place in situ, as you would say, it's very much like the indigenous approach. Mm-hmm. So it's not linear. It's constantly changing. So it's all of these other things. And why was I talking about that?
Well, you were going to tell that you actually took a course on Derrida.
For my philosophers, I did sit in on those philosophy classes, didn't I? Anyway, way back in the early days, one of the concepts that influenced me and Derrida's work, especially in language, is that the meaning is not in just the word, but there was a metaphor used that it's like music. And so you don't get the melody until you have what came before and what comes after. Mm. And so that's what David has always emphasized too, the context. And so this image that it's not meaning until we know what came before and what comes after influenced my views of research and storytelling. Derrida and Leotard. Mm-hmm.
This conversation reminds me of I was watching a master class by a physicist whose name I forget at this second, but he said that science today is at a frontier, and the only science we can have is stabbing at a question and hoping we're even on the right path, that our question, that we're not off on some thing over here studying something that will turn out to be meaningless. That really all scientists should come to this with the sense of, I know nothing, but my best guess right now is, where is my best guess going to take me? So personally, we are expecting young scientists who are just coming out of a class where they've been told this by this, by this, by this. And then we're launching them into a world where they have to get really comfortable really quick with constant change. And if they're going to be good, they need to have that creative right brain, left brain thing going on from the very beginning.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's why we have worked for 20 years with Henri Sauval in France. And I think he's influenced both of us. It's been an interesting process. But their view of interventions in organizations is that every intervention is an experiment. It's exactly what you said, Alana. They come in with like, well, we don't know. Let's look and see. What do we see?
Yeah, they're 99% listening and 1% questions. So they really
that's really difficult. I mean, in American institutions want to hire a consultant, and they want the consultant to consult. They don't want the consultant to come in and listen.
They listen for months at a time and just really soak in all the discourses, the political, the executive, the technical, engineering, everything. They just soak it all in, and they say, oh, your script is kind of a mess, They say approach it as a theater script and say, well, it's a discombobbled mess. So what we'll recommend is you get a better script. We'll write a better script that makes better sense for everybody. And they really get them to take notice of the language and the discourse. And what our contribution has been is to the storytelling. So we've been encouraging them to adopt storytelling as a method,
Well, let's see what next we. Okay, so that turns off the slides or the video for today. I've encouraged you to go to wooclap.com/story science and take a look at, and really, if you would start the sentence, I need, that would be helpful because someone did. And they said they needed a list of the philosophers and what was important about them. So if you're going to take this on, what is it you need? You need to understand Hannah mentioned the difference between narrative inquiry and if that's a need. So go please to Story Science, www.wooclap.com/Story Science, and give me some needs that will help direct what I'll do next week. And I'll take a look at I'll answer the first one. I'll take a look at the philosophers and bullet point what he said were the key points that he took out of those philosophers. That'll set up our conversation theoretically. And then there'll be a piece of video, which is the part that hasn't been shown yet, where he discusses, I'll go through what I see as basics for what is this getting the anti-narrative. There's been a theme here about how we get not just the specific melody of a moment, but the whole melodic line of the symphony behind it. That's, I think that was a nice analogy of what we're going for. We're trying to see not just a little tiny bit of something, but to try to put that something in a context and to tease it out in a way where we're also looking for what we don't understand and what we get wrong as we go. I think that's the process we're on. And then we'll see a little bit more of his languaging from, and he did a really nice job of talking about the process, and then we'll close it out and we'll see how this has meaning. I will send an email probably later today to everyone who is signed up, and Hannah, I'll include recordings. I'll give a short snapshot. So these are the recordings of what we've done. These are the videos that are up, and this is what'll happen next week. Really? Oh, okay. So if you go, just for everyone here, if you go to this, I know several times I'll get emails asking for recordings. So let me just tell you, empower you actually to be able to do that on your own. If you go here, that's the basic Big Marker community site. That's where all of the webinars upcoming show up. And if you scroll down about 3 down, it says on demand, and then on the right hand side it says view more. If you click on view more, 6 come up instead of 3, and then under the 6 there's a little downward arrow, and you can keep clicking that downward arrow and see every webinar we've done for 4 years. So that will help you find stuff, and the ones that were there would be there. And Hannah, I see that you're in twice, so that might have been part of your echo problem today. Thank you for the 8 of you that have stayed. We'll get a wrap up. Apologies, of course, for technology, but the thing was, I think I set it up for Irish Daylight Time, and their system read the time for Irish Standard Time, and of course they're an hour different. So I'll have a conversation with them about that. By and large, though, we use Big Marker because they allow us to have that page that I just put up there. I think the power of being able to go back and find things that you've seen before and figure out things you're missing when later on you're writing about them precludes the small irritations that we have sometimes. So that's me today. Anything else, please go to Story Science. Nobody has yet, but please write in what you need, because that will help our conversation next week. And David, I'm not sure, were you here when, and did you see a clip today, the way I should put it, about their conversation about working with Indigenous people? You're welcome, Olga. Thank you, Pat. David had had a conversation. He had come to open office times, which some of you probably know now. I'm holding on Wednesdays, and it's a place to just come in and talk about whatever. And he talked about his research, which is with Indigenous population. And I brought that to Grace Ann. And what she said was, watch out for the IRB, because their experience with IRBs going into Indigenous populations would be that you would have a difficult time passing. And they recommended that your committee that has some Native people on it help you with that if it's going to be a problem for you. So that was their heads up. As always, tell me what you need and we'll try to get it to you as we move forward. Anybody left in the room have any questions? But do consider, if you were going to go to a wrap up, if you really wanted to do this, what would you need before it ended? You're welcome. You're welcome, David. Hope to see you again in another open house or open office hours, I guess, using the university setting. Anybody else? If not, I'll thank you very much for coming. Very good. Excellent, Pat. wooclap.com/story science. And thank you for adding to it. That will guide us next week, and watch for my email. And good, please drop in at office hours. That's when we get to know each other. It's a bit of fun. I realized because of the COVID, people may need a little bit more touch in different ways, and this allows it to be in global conversation. Have a good week as well, Olga. And with that, I will end the webinar, which will kick you all out. So see you next week.